Wives, submit yourselves to your husband as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. Oh, thanks. This passage can feel hard, but I love the Bible and I know it is all about Jesus. So, what do we do with hard passages? We tackle them with context, look for Jesus, have grace for ourselves, and use all of that to learn all that we can from it and apply what we have learned to our lives right now. Something that can help with this is when you begin to look around what you are reading. Last week, Kate took us through the beginning of this chapter and told us that we are chosen by God, holy because of what he has done for us on the cross, and truly loved by God. It says, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. That is where we begin. Not with a list that is difficult, but with love. We are made for a relationship with God, and we messed it up, and still do. We do something called sin. This is actions that are against God. It happens in so many ways. This breaks our relationship both with God, putting a chasm-sized gap between us and him, but also with one another. It results in us treating others negatively, and it causes divisions between us. There is a consequence for sin. It is death. We cannot fix this on our own, but God knew that. He knew this was going to happen and that we are going to continue to sin. But if relationship with God is what we're made for, he had to make a way. He planned for this. He planned to cross that chasm-sized gap that we created. He sent his son Jesus to be perfect in this world, never sinning or breaking his relationship with God ever. So, when he was killed, the consequence of death was not just, and so he was raised from the dead. This sacrifice was for the sins of every person, past, present, and future. This means that your relationship with God can happen right now just by believing what Jesus did on the cross for your sins. Something happens when you believe this, when you truly understand it. You learn what Jesus did and it changes you. You want to become more like the Jesus that never sinned. This is where this passage comes from. Following this passage is part of the outpouring of wanting to live like Jesus did and tells us to do. Because we know who we are, but more importantly, we know who he is. With all of that in mind, I'm going to pray real quick. Father, thank you so much that you have brought us here this morning. I pray that this would be a space of healing and listening to what your word has to say about this. Father, let us listen to the parts that are helpful and of you and ignore the parts that are from me. Amen. We're talking about relationships. Relationships are good and hard. That's because we're good and we sin. But what if, with effort, they could show others the love of God for us in our relationships? That would be a beautiful, not perfect, never perfect, beautiful picture to the rest of the world. This passage is also about authority and submission. Submission can be a word that we struggle picturing in this way. It is not about being forced to do anything, nor is it about having no say. Communication is the foundation of every relationship. This is about structuring our relationships. And something that we have to remember in all of this is that God has the ultimate authority over all of us. And part of following God is to submit to him. If God is the example of the ultimate authority, what does that look like? It is shown perfectly in Jesus, who chooses to love servant-heartedly to the point that he dies so that we can live. I think Philippians 2 perfectly sums this up by saying, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. If you look back at our passage, each submission is reminding those who submit that it is for God, the Lord. Submission is a beautiful picture of how we love God well. Those with authority are reminded to be loving and just in their authority. Why? Because you know who has the ultimate authority over you and how he chooses to lead. I would like to point out at this point, I am talking about when this is being done well. I am under no illusions that this is at times not the case. This passage is hard because we have all experienced this not being done well to varying degrees. Also, if we're really honest, probably not doing this well to varying degrees. When I said sin is also about hurting others, that includes abusing the authority that has been placed on us to a person. It destroys relationships and harms those who are submitting to the authority. This passage is a challenge to those with authority to hold that with the honor, respect, and dedication it deserves. Submission should only be done when the one with authority is doing their job correctly, with the servant-hearted leadership that Jesus shows. So, let's talk about these relationships. Husbands and wives. I want to point out that we are talking about a very different time. We are talking about when philosophers' thinking was massive. Aristotle particularly, huge. Something he famously says is that men are above women, children, and slaves because it is that way in nature. That was the common logic at the time, particularly about women, that they were natural-born submitters. You know what Paul doesn't do in this letter? State that as a reason. No, he reframes it completely in a revolutionary way for the time. He says, wives, submit, not because nature says so, but because it is for the Lord. Again, not having no say, everything is built on discussion, but there has to be trust that your husband is going to lead you properly because he knows who Jesus is. Paul states that the husbands are not just natural leaders, which in some ways suggests that they need no guidance because it's second nature. Instead, there are rules set for them to love and love well. Who do we learn to love well from? Jesus. So, husbands, you need to love your wife in the servant-hearted way that Jesus does. The one who accepts the unaccepted, sacrifices everything, is willing to die for the one submitting. Paul also sets this out in Ephesians, going further into detail about the expectations on husbands being related to Jesus' relationship to the church. It says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without sin or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. What would loving your wife look like if you did it like that? The bar is set so much higher than the words suggest. When you do love like that, the world can see the difference in your relationship and will ask you about it. The next relationship is children and parents. This one probably feels more logical to us. Children are young and should learn from their parents. It says something similar in the Ten Commandments back in Exodus. But parents need to be an authority to their children, worthy of obedience. You are to care about your children's feelings because your words and actions have consequences on them. When you use your authority to negatively impact your children, of course they will become discouraged. That does not mean you do not correct them. Of course you do. But remember how often and how much you mess up and how God chooses to deal with you. Does he get angry at you, guilt trip you, or make you feel discouraged? No. He extends grace more than you can ever deserve. When you lead from a place of understanding that and loving your children, it puts into perspective why you correct with compassion. From there, your children's obedience is from a place of trust in a parent who cares for them well. The final relationship. There is an uncomfortable number of words given for slavery here. I want to make something clear to you. God is against slavery. The God of the Bible is the one who breaks his people out of slavery, not keeps people in it. We do not discount the rest of the Bible for one passage, nor do we ignore a passage. So, what do? We have to understand the Bible is a book speaking to a people in a certain time in history, while pointing people to take steps to a better and more correct future. So, we look at the full picture of the Bible. What does the Bible's story of slavery say? Well, let's start at the Old Testament. When God's people are in slavery in Exodus, God frees them from it. He doesn't leave them hoping that the Egyptians who don't know God are going to change. He liberates, he protects and guides them. A couple generations later, Solomon builds the temple as a place to worship God, and he uses slaves to build it. You know what that temple held? The 10 Commandments, given as a gift by God to those he saved from slavery. The people of Israel are so quick to forget what God thinks of slavery. What happened to Solomon? Well, in 2 places in the Bible, it states that the weight of gold Solomon receives annually is 666. For those of you who are unaware, 6 is a number in the Bible that symbolizes falling short of perfection. And particularly 666 is often related to evil, in particular the devil or the enemy, whatever you would like to name him. If you want to call someone out for unholy actions in the Bible, that is the number that you use. Solomon chose to keep slaves, and that is absolutely part of his unholy actions. Moving into the New Testament, Jesus never once discounts a person for their status in society. Instead, he respects them, loves them, and teaches them who God is. Paul, the writer of this letter, preaches in Caesar's household, a man who definitely has slaves. Paul contradicts Roman standards of living and replaces them with Christian ones. So when we read of slaves in this passage, we cannot think that God forgot his position on slavery. Instead, Paul is directing slaves on how to live within the society they have been given, while teaching their masters to treat slaves properly, not as property. This passage is not validation for slavery, but instructions for those within a system with the aim to eventually tear down that system in its entirety. We have now, in theory, broken down that system. So, what truth do we find in it as people who do not keep slaves? There are instructions that are helpful for the workplace, in workers and supervisors. It's about how we carry ourselves in our day-to-day lives within our workplaces. What would it look like as a worker to respect those in authority placed above you at work? To do your work with sincerity? We love to moan and gossip, especially about people above us. But what if instead, knowing that we do all things to worship and serve the Lord, including in our work lives, it changes us and our attitudes? What influence would we have, and how positive would it be if we chose to be diligent in our workplaces? What about as a supervisor? They're told to be right and fair. This means treating those you are given authority over as Jesus leads, sacrificially, servant-heartedly. Again, this is a much higher bar than it looks. For a start, all of your injustices will be brought up before God. Jesus is once again your example, who washed his disciples' feet, placing himself in the position of a servant. Never consider yourself above those you lead, because you have a master in heaven. I run camps to tell young people about Jesus for a living. That's what I do. My boss is such an amazing example of this, especially when we're on those camps. We never hear about the worst jobs because he is doing them himself. He has unclogged more toilets than any of us, and I've done that job, grim. That is servant-hearted leadership. That means if he asks any of us to do something, we know full well he's done it first. So we follow his lead and trust him because he has shown us what Jesus would do. What would treating your employees properly do to the work environment? Under the knowledge that however high in the company, you are God's and you answer only to him. What influence would you have on the culture at work, to the employees that are under you, but also to the other supervisors when they see how you behave towards people that are in a position below you? In all of these relationships, we are taught things about authority and those who submit in the time that they are in. If you look, who are the ones that have to go against societal norms every single time? Those in authority. They are the ones making drastic changes. Christians who have been given authority are the ones by society have to be revolutionary in their leadership. It is their job not just to lead well, but push society towards the better future by creating real cultural changes. God is protecting those who are told to submit, because creating cultural changes could be dangerous or harmful for them. That is the God that saves his people from slavery, the protector of those without authority. He has created a system for real-world change being possible when the Christians in authority take a stand. That is why the bar for those in authority is so much higher than the world's. To love those who submit so well that the leaders show the people around them who Jesus is. We are all called to remember who has the ultimate authority, God. But those who have been given authority on earth must lead from the example of Jesus, who challenged society powerfully in his words and his actions for those who could not. He ate with sinners, he spoke to outcasts like the Samaritan woman, he healed people seen to be unclean like those suffering with leprosy. He stood up for a woman who was going to be stoned to death for her sins. He washed his disciples' feet. He flipped tables so that people who were not Jewish could worship. He was so different from society in every way, standing up for those who had no authority and consistently pushed the world to be better. So too should those who lead. What happens when you do this? Well, for the people who we read about in the Bible, who Jesus stood up for without authority, it changed their lives completely. I want to share a story to show how good leaders have been helpful in my life. I was at work a few years ago and I messed up. It wrecked me. I couldn't function. The big block of those camps is actually 4 weeks in a row. So messing up early on the second week, while handling all of my responsibilities, keeping the young people unaware, and making sure that I had 2 weeks left in me, it really genuinely killed me. I had the longest and most intense anxiety attack of my life so far. And the leaders that are above me sat me down and we discussed what happened. They never once gave the impression they were disappointed, nor did they tell me off. Bit like spiritual parents or employers, I guess. They had authority and they could have chosen to deal with me and call me out for what I did. Instead, they cared for me, but how I was doing. They made sure I was looking after myself because I wasn't. They forced me to take breaks and took most of my responsibilities off me and took them on themselves. I deserved to be told off. I messed up. I already knew that. And I was honestly doing enough telling off for the both of us. So instead, I got grace in the bucket loads. That is why I felt so incredibly safe in a space where I was spiraling. I knew I wasn't going down because my leaders had hold of me in the most amazing way. So I came out of that week a little broken, but very much still okay, and had another 2 amazing weeks of pointing young people to Jesus that followed. That could not have happened without proper leadership. We all want to receive that kind of love, whether we're children, employees, friends, or spouses. That's the kind of love that makes it easier for us to choose to submit well. If I know someone truly has my back, I can trust them. And that is what we've seen through this passage. It is the instruction to act in trust. But what we miss if we forget the first 3 chapters of Colossians is who God is, what he's like, and what difference that makes to the way we relate to him and to each other. So, first, trust him. Then use how you trust him to go and trust others. That is the power of showing Jesus. It is because we know our inheritance is secured in what Jesus has done, dying for us. That should change who we are and so how we lead and are led. That is the hope in this for the renewal of those who witness it. Imagine what would happen to our city if we followed these instructions properly. What if, when we saw injustice, we spoke up? What if, within our houses, we welcomed the lonely, the stranger, the outsider? What if we showed Jesus in how we loved one another and it made them ask us why? That gives us the opportunity to share the good news of Jesus from our small example.